Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Dylan Pahman.
Hello.
Dylan Pahman is executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality, Research Fellow here at the Acton Institute, and founder and president of the St. Nicholas Cabasilas Institute for Orthodoxy and Liberty. Today, we are here discussing his new book. If you're wondering, wait, he has another new book already? No. I promised during that earlier conversation about the kingdom of God and the common good, Orthodox Christian Social Thought, that I would bring Dylan back because there's this Inception-like quality to Dylan's book. Part of it is about Orthodox social thought. All of it's about Orthodox social thought. But there's a moment where you step back and you're like, listen, we got to talk about economic science and the history of modern economics to really unpack this. And you offer basically like a mini history of economic thought right on part 4 of your book. So I want to talk about that. But the other thing is the last time we talked about this, it was before the book was out. Mm-hmm. And the book has been out and it's gotten an outstanding reception so far.
Yeah, it's been great.
There's been a lot that's happened. You've been busy. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I've been on, at least half a dozen different podcasts talking about the book. I spoke here at Acton to promote it right before it came out. I spoke at a local parish, and I'm hoping to do more of that. I have some more podcasts lined up. I'm not sure exactly when this will air, so I can't say which ones are still coming or which ones are out there. And even hopefully some in-person speaking as well. So I'd love to come visit if anybody's parish has like a speaker series and a budget and all of that. I'd love to be a part of it. I think it's a really important conversation that the book can really help get going in everybody's parish. So that's what I've been working on. Yeah.
It's a conversation starter. Conversations are starting. You've also done some teaching. You've done a course already based on the book.
So I did a course for St. Athanasius College, which is an online Orthodox college based on the book. It was a 5-week course, and I really enjoyed the experience. The students were great. It was a lot to do all of that in 5 weeks, but they did a great job. And we'll see. I've been talking with them about maybe coming back to do it just for enrichment, which would be shorter sessions but longer Q&A, and then that would be recorded and be the sort of thing that people could, sign up for and order and just kind of experience on their own time. So we'll see if that happens. But again, just like I'd love to come speak at your parish, I'd love to teach at your school as long as I can still live in Grand Rapids while I do it.
So this is, speaking of Grand Rapids, Acton University dates are out now.
Yeah.
There will be a lecture based on this.
That's right. I'll be talking about Orthodox social thought at Acton, and I have spoken about the topic in the past, but all of those were before the book was out. So it will be a new lecture. There might be some overlap, but it'll be a lot more refined, I think, at that point. And yeah, I'll be talking about it again. And I'll be, really looking forward to who I can network with, anybody else who's interested in this kind of thing. And I really love the ecumenical conversation that we get at Acton University. So I'm hoping that it's going to be, hopefully we'll get, more Orthodox attendance and more Orthodox people. But also really anybody who shows up, I always have a great time. So.
And part of this book, the other parts of this book that we talked about the previous time we had you on to talk about this book, talks about traditions and social thought outside of Orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And so in the preparation and the writing of these books, you immersed yourself not only, of course, in Orthodox social thought, but sort of re-examined other traditions and social thought, which Well, I'm sure will show up in your talk at Acton University as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely mention kind of there is a certain ecumenical common ground that all Christian traditions share in common, and I think it's really good to lay down that groundwork because that to me is the basis for really enriching conversation where we can find all of this, 70 to 80% that we share in common, and then we can talk about, okay, here's maybe our unique perspectives. Sometimes they differ, sometimes they contrast, but other times they might be complementary. And establishing that common ground, I think, helps us have those conversations in a more ironic way.
There's also the 100% common ground that we have in social science, in particular economics. Sure. And that's where I want to turn to today. What is economics? And why did you think in a book in Orthodox Social Thought, you have to not only give people a definition to it, but sort of walk them through the history of the discipline? Why is it so important for social thought?
Yeah. So Christian social thought refers to, the social question of the 19th century, which had to do with the problem of the working poor in the industrial era. It was a new social problem, and social tended to kind of mean economic in the 19th century. So it was the kind of economic question. You had people coming out of the country because they're hoping for a better life in urban centers, and in the long run, they did all actually benefit for the most part. But in the short term, there were a lot of harsh working conditions, no limits on, hours that people could work, days people could work, ages of people who could work, things like that. You had children going down the mines and up chimneys and in factories and all sorts of issues with injuries, and then no compensation and, things that we just take for granted today. There wasn't any of that right then. And there was also this bigger problem of business, as we know it today, was actually a very new realm of life. So in the early modern era, one of the pieces of common ground that Christian traditions had was when our catechisms talk about the commandment to honor your father and mother. They'd usually go on and talk about also you need to honor other legitimate authorities, so state authority and church authority. And so basically their map of society is family, church, and state. And that worked for them because that was an accurate map of society at the time. But by the 19th century, it's kind of dated, and I think even more so since then. And so that's part of the question is how do we even conceive of this new social reality? And then what do we do about these people who are kind of caught in the middle? That they're aware of like these great gains to society and to the economy, but at the same time, there's this harsh contrast with the lives of some people who are actually doing the work to produce these new products. So that's where economics enters the picture, and the modern discipline typically is traced to Adam Smith, but we here at Acton we often remind people that there is a prehistory to economics, and so this part 4 kind of walks people through that history because that prehistory starts with some Christian theologians in the West. They're not Orthodox theologians, they're not Eastern, right? But there's still some interesting things we can learn from their approach. So to get back to your question of what is economics.
Well, wait.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's talk about pre-economics before economics, because you painted a picture of you have this sort of Dickensian moment where you have this big push into urban centers from the countryside. You have this sort of mass proletariat, immiserated. What's going on in the countryside
literally
is very
a new
different.
Bourgeois class. Like I think Marxist analysis of their class relations is wrong, but there is a reality that there's this kind of the nouveau riche, right? That come out of this. People that weren't aristocrats suddenly are finding themselves very well off. So instead of having to inherit your wealth, you could actually just make wealth. That's a very new reality as well.
and it's wealth that's related to capital and not just land, which is also very new. But in this prehistory we're talking about, in these early theologians, jurists, they're not living in that 19th century world yet.
Right.
Yet they're encountering sort of the elements of economics.
Right.
What does their world look like, and what
So-
problems are they trying to solve?
Yeah, so the big shift, I mean, and it is one of the biggest ones in at least Western European history or just human history, is the discovery of the New World. So a lot of these writers were Spanish scholastics, although other other writers, not just Roman Catholics, but Protestants of various other traditions and regions eventually did contribute as well. But usually, and it does date back to the School of Salamanca in Spain. This is contemporary with, Columbus and, the founding of the New World. And there's a few things that happen. So you have this increase of commerce, this big commercial boom because of all the new stuff that's coming in from the New World. But you also have the Spanish, their colonialism was very extractive. So they wanted to go and take as much as they could. And in particular, they reasoned that if you have more gold, you are more rich. This is a very common assumption of people in the ancient world. And that's true if there's a fixed amount of gold. What they didn't get was that they were bringing in more gold. And
a whole new world's worth of gold.
Literally, yes. And so when you bring in new gold, what you do is you increase the amount of gold and you decrease the demand. And these scholastics are noticing that something is happening when you increase the money supply to the value of the money itself. And then on top of that, the kings at the time of Spain and other places were listening to some bad advisors that said, if you really want to get rich, you don't have to put all the gold into the coin. Like you could just, kind of mix in a little bit of silver, or some baser metal. And so they debased their coins. And so there was actual inflationary policy happening where they were literally, degrading the money. And so you have these scholastics that are trying to figure out, okay, how do I counsel people who are, maybe they're not quite capitalists in the modern day sense, but they're part of this small merchant class that always existed that's now booming, right? They're doing this international trade, and they need capital to do their trade, and usually that meant loans and loans with interest. So they're trying to deal with this whole question because lending at interest is often equated with, and back then was literally equated with, the sin of usury.
Yep.
And at least in the West it was. That's kind of one of the interesting East-West differences. And so they're dealing with this moral problem. You have these pious merchants who need to do this work in order to provide for their families, but at the same time, they're worried about their soul. And so they're going to confessors, and those confessors need guidance. And so that's where some of this is coming from. And then the other side is, they are seeing the effect of inflation and how it just eats away at the wealth of a society. So in the 16th century, the prices in Spain doubled twice. I mean, that is the effect of inflation. So I guess that would be, 400%, right, in over a century. That's a lot. And for them, I mean, it was almost like apocalyptic. I mean, it was really hard to deal with and hard to understand. And so they understand, they figured out some of the basics of supply and demand. They have some sense of Gresham's law, which is the idea that bad money drives out good, that as soon as you introduce the bad money, but before the prices have adjusted, people are going to rush to get the bad money because you can get more of it, and then try to spend it as quickly as they can in order to get a little more than what they should have with that amount of money. But of course, the prices catch up, and so you end up just losing all of the pure coins, and it all gets replaced with the bad coinage, and just everybody is actually lost out in the long run. So there's all sorts of insight that just came out of their moral analysis. They're working with the scholastic method and natural law, and they're trying their best to be good theologians and pastors. And it kind of sets a foundation that really did matter later on. I mean, you don't find like Adam Smith, citing Mariana or Molina or something like that, but he's part of a tradition of thought that certainly is indebted to that. And certainly economic historians have at least claimed as much.
So you have these folks who are seeing real world consequences of bad monetary policy, and then also, just sort of these great sort of discoveries of natural resources that are disrupting monetary equilibriums that have existed for millennia. And you've got them trying to go through that. You've got them also trying to sort of find pastoral responses to the moral concerns of this new merchant class, these new sort of commercial realities of a commercial society emerging. What changes? These are all economic questions that they're answering, but they're not reasoning about it as economics per se.
Right.
They're trying to explain things they're seeing in the world. They're coming up with tools that later economists will adapt and use in their toolbox. But Adam Smith starts doing something that's more rigorous and scientific and comprehensive. What is that project?
So, I mean, Smith was a moral philosopher. So there is more continuity there than people realize. And although back then moral philosophy was kind of like social philosophy, it didn't necessarily mean good and evil, although that was involved. But to back up just a minute, the common definition of economics today comes from Lionel Robbins. And that's how I start this section of the book, because that's what you're going to find in most textbooks. And that is the utilization of scarce resources for limited ends which have alternative uses. That's the one-sentence definition. Really what that boils down to is opportunity cost. So it's not just about money, for example. That's a common misconception. It certainly often involves money. It's about material well-being and all of that. But really, economics is a science of human behavior, and behavior under the constraints of scarcity. It's a analysis of opportunity costs, that if you use resources for one thing, you can't then use them for something else. And that's going to shape your behavior. You're going to economize. You're going to actually evaluate and weigh the costs and the benefits of, well, do I want to use it for that, or do I want to use it for that, or do I want to hold on to it and wait for something else, or whatever. That's what economists are studying. In Adam Smith's time, what he was doing, and this is how the economists after him understood what they were doing as well for quite a while, is actually political economy. And less well known is that Robbins thought that political economy was still a useful category. He said, you can have strict analysis, and we should call that economics. And basically the profession agreed with him on that. And then he said, but we should also have more value-laden interdisciplinary application, where we're incorporating history and the other social sciences and even ethics and morality, perhaps even religion. He at least uses some biblical examples in his works. But that basically, he didn't win out on that. If anything, the discipline kind of went in the direction of welfare economics, which is sort of, we'll come up with a criteria and then we'll formalize that into a model. Something like... well, I don't know. There's quite a few, like Rawls. There's a Rawlsian welfare, standard, and there's other ones like that. I can't the Pareto optimality. There it is. That's the one that I'm thinking of. And so that's kind of what you get as far as normative economics today. It's still kind of value free because it's just it's trying to reduce everything to numbers and go from there.
Or utilitarian.
Sure.
I mean, it's a welfare function that they're solving for.
Right. Although usually they'll make the caveat, though. They'll be like, well, if you want to improve, material wealth, here's how you do it. If you want to, improve material well-being along these categories, this is how you do it. But they usually won't go so far as to be like, well, we should because that's good. Right? So, there's a definite distinction there. Whereas Adam Smith and the classical economists, and really one thing I discovered is a lot of economists after Smith for a long time, much longer than I'd realized, still are doing political economy. They might also understand, like Robbins, that there is something unique and value-free about the strict analysis that they do, but they want to solve real-world problems that they're seeing in the world around them. Alfred Marshall, at the beginning of the 20th century, in his textbook, which was the dominant English language textbook for 2 or 3 decades, he talks about the moral vocation of economics. It's study of the creation of wealth to alleviate the suffering of the poor. You see a kind of continual concern with morality. Some of these economists are better at morality than others.
Yes.
Maybe we'll get into that. But that's the key distinction. And so what I try to outline is that Christian social thought is basically a Christian approach to political economy, right? So it needs the tools of economics, but then it needs to apply them in an interdisciplinary way. And that's why I thought I need a whole section to talk about modern economics. And then I could have, of course, tried to do a little more systematically and said, well, here's supply and demand, here's a supply and demand curve, and here's elasticity and marginal utility. I could have done all of that, but then it just would have been dry and theoretical. It might still be hard to read, but I just, I already wrote that book, frankly, for Acton. I recommend it in 2017, Foundations of a Free and Virtuous Society. So if people want a Christian perspective written by me on modern economic principles and issues, you can get it there. But the other side of that is that my thinking is to tell the history of the discipline and the history of how economies changed from 1800 to the present. Which is monumental and really unprecedented in human history. It then tells the story and it humanizes these people. These were not, for the most part, just academics sitting in their offices contemplating, well, what about this and what about that? They were looking into the world around them and saying, what can we do to help these people? And sometimes their solutions were good in many cases, and we live in the fruit of it today, this world of abundance. But there were many times where they took some wrong turns, and I think that those are just as instructive as their successes as well.
What's really interesting about this tradition, and which is undervalued by most scholars who look into it, not yourself, not for a lot of people we work with at Acton, is that just as a lot of these early history is sort of pre-economist economists.
Yeah.
These early people are priests, they're theologians, they're ministers that are looking at these questions. That's also true of even a lot of the classical political economists well into the 19th century.
Oh, yeah.
What is that history that a lot of times people don't overlook? Like maybe they remember these names in a textbook, but they don't realize that they were actually, in many cases, even churchmen.
Right. So you have, the next political economist after Adam Smith is Thomas Robert Malthus, and he is an Anglican parson in a rural parish, and he is seeing rural poverty, and he's wondering, how does this happen? He cares about his people, and he comes up with what he thinks is the explanation. That's his principle of population. Basically, that the reproduction, human reproduction, is outpacing the rate at which they can grow enough food. And there's all sorts of problems with the government's attempt to fix it, the poor laws, that's actually motivating people to get married younger, have children younger, and actually perpetuate their problem. That's his analysis anyway. And you go on from there, and you have people like Richard Whately, Thomas Chalmers, Edward Coppleton, and even in the late 19th century, during the Marginal Revolution, Philip Wicksteed is like a Unitarian minister. I mean, you still have some of these figures, or at least people with strong convictions, like John Bates Clark is originally a Christian socialist, and then he eventually abandons his socialist position soon after, a few years after discovering the principle of marginal utility. But he's still a Christian, and it still animates what he does. Alfred Marshall has issues, morally speaking, but he is also a Christian, and that comes through in his economics textbook. And all of this, I think, is really interesting. So, in the United States, you have people like Francis Wayland and McVicker. I can't remember his first name. But you have the clerical economists is what they're called in America, the Christian classical or Christian political economy in England. And these are people that are contemporary with like David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill. And typically when the history of the discipline is rehearsed, you only hear about Ricardo and Mill. And maybe you'll hear about Malthus, because he was very influential. But these other guys were important. They weren't necessarily so important for like intellectual breakthroughs. So it's true that Ricardo and the principle of comparative advantage, like he really refined that and articulated that well. Mill did a great job just kind of getting the discipline a bit more systematized. And I mean, his massive principles was kind of the common textbook for a long time. So it's not like they don't do or deserve their due attention. But some of these other guys, like Copleston wrote to Robert Peel to, advocate for the repeal of the Corn Law. And many of these guys did, with the exception of Malthus, who thought it was a good thing, but he really is the exception. And that mattered. That advocacy changed the policy. And the change of the policy meant actually solving Malthus's problem to some extent. They could get cheaper, more abundant food. And they increased the wealth for everyone, except for a few agrarian landowners who maybe suffered from international competition. But by and large, the society benefited from their work there. And that's something that I think needs to be told, that these people were motivated by moral convictions and used the tools of this emerging new discipline to deal with these social problems of their time. So we should be able to do that today as well. I mean, that's kind of the idea. If we can learn their history, learn what they did, and learn our own tradition as well, we can put those two together, and maybe we can feel a little less helpless and a little less lost when it comes to modern challenges of, AI and the internet and globalization and other sorts of things that kind of mark our contemporary economies.
In the 19th century, you also get, in response to these sort of social questions, the emergence of socialism and a variety of socialisms and sort of reformist movements. What's their relationship to the emerging sort of systems of political economy?
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter on socialists and social reformers, and I really focus on three main groups. There's more than that, but I do think it's important to mention that there were actually a lot of varieties of socialism. I think today people either think in a sort of facile way that any government program is socialism, which is silly because basically all of these economists thought that there should be some government programs. So that's really not the line to draw. Or you just have this equation with socialism and Marxism. And I'm sure Karl Marx would be very happy about that. But that was not the reality in his time at all. And there's been some good work. Phil Magnus, for example, has done some research to show that the popularity of Marx and the proliferation of his works doesn't really happen until after the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks and the Soviets get their propaganda machine going. And one of the things that they promote is the works of Karl Marx, because they're ideologically committed to Marxism. So really before that time, throughout the 19th century, Marx was of one voice among many, and he was actually kind of this oddball voice of this guy in London writing in German that, there were people that read what he wrote, but you have things like the Paris Revolution in 1848 happened, I think, a day or two after the publication of the Communist Manifesto, unrelated. You could not, it wasn't like you could email it to people back then, right? It did not get around that fast. Something else was going on. And you have people like anarchists like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. You have a whole French tradition of socialism. You have in England socialism, and this might be true in other contexts as well, but socialism was actually distinctly apolitical until the 1850s. So it was more about we want worker cooperation, right, rather than competition. They saw the factory owners as kind of pitting workers against each other, and they're like, well, we want to get together. So you can look at that as the births of organized labor comes out of that. But what you see in England, in particular, I look at the Christian socialists. Who were the first three are F.D. Morris, who was kind of the elder of the group, and then Alfred Kingsley and John. Why am I blanking on the name? Yeah, Ludlow. Thank you.
Yep.
And John Ludlow. And their focus was these Christian worker cooperatives, right? They were like entrepreneurial ventures, and they didn't really succeed. Part of that's the people running them didn't have a great amount of business savvy. Maybe they were too idealistic, but part of that's actually a legal obstacle. So Ross Emmett pointed this out a few years ago at a conference that we hosted. He was the plenary speaker,
yes.
And then we published that later on in the Journal of Markets and Morality. And he points out that they didn't have limited liability protections until the Tony Blair administration, right? So that kind of cooperative was at a huge disadvantage in terms of finding investment compared to a traditional business. And so that's really an interesting point of the history as well. And then, I have done a little work on F.D. Morris, and he's just a fascinating figure. I have an article coming, I think in the spring, Religion and Liberty, where I profile his life and work. And he's even out of step in some ways with the other Christian socialists of his time, in that he is an admirer of Adam Smith. He doesn't necessarily think that Smith got everything right, but he's far quicker to compliment him than criticize him. He criticizes utilitarianism. He doesn't like Jeremy Bentham. But he knew Mill. He was on friendly terms with John Stuart Mill. He says things like in 1848, he was preaching a series of homilies on the Lord's Prayer, and he says that property is holy. Like, imagine the contrast between Karl Marx at the same time and Engels writing the Communist Manifesto and the first Christian socialists saying, I got to tell you something about property. It's holy. Why is it holy? Well, it's part of this order of society that God has ordained, which has church, state, and family. It's that old map, that old Christian map that he's working with. But he creatively tries to apply it to the challenges he's facing. And really his goal, at least I argue, is far more focused on evangelism and education. What he wants is for people to understand the gospel. And he wants them to join the Church of England, because he's a minister of the Church of England. And he's actually very successful if you evaluate what he does based on his own standard. Their movement fizzled out by 1854, but he went from teaching at King's College. He got fired because it came out that he was kind of a universalist, and they didn't like that. But at the same time, the Working Men's College was founded in London, and they asked him to be the first president. So he said, "Great, I got time, right?" But it was exactly the sort of thing he wanted. He loved education, and it was the first institution in Europe to offer liberal education to working class people. And it still exists to this day. I mean, imagine any night school. I mentioned earlier I taught this class based on my book for St. Athanasius College. That was Tuesday nights for 4 hours. All these people, all my students had jobs, right? They are the fruit of his work, in part, anyway. And that's a really positive legacy, I think. It's maybe not quite what people think of when they think of socialism, but that's what I thought it was important to highlight. That even today there are, young people especially tend to be kind of drawn to, well, we need to care more about people, and maybe socialism is not so bad. And I do think there's a lot of bad socialism out there, but I think if you know someone like that, maybe just give them F.D. Morris's social morality and say, well, how about this kind of Christian socialism? And it'll steer them in a much better direction.
So you have all of these folks, you have these Christian socialists, you have these materialistic, atheistic, sort of scientific, quote unquote, socialists. You have the classical political economists, some of whom are also of religious conviction. All of them get disrupted, though.
Yeah.
And the discipline gets sort of reinvented towards the tail end of the 19th century with the marginal revolution. What is the marginal revolution, and how does it sort of revolutionize thinking about economics?
Yeah, so before that time, there was some understanding. I don't think it's quite accurate to say that everyone agreed with the labor theory of value. Karl Marx certainly did. He thought that the price of something directly reflects the amount of labor put into producing it. And you can see where he maybe got that a little bit from Adam Smith, maybe a bit more from David Ricardo. But Smith is actually a bit more nuanced. He understands that there can be he talks about the natural price and the market price, but really what he's talking about is like cost, right? There can be a difference between the cost of making something and the amount of price, the amount of money it'll fetch at the market, and people will adjust based on how much people are actually willing to pay. They'll adjust what they're going to produce because they don't want to make something at a loss, right?
Yep. And these are debates that even those scholastics we talked about earlier,
oh yes,
they're concerned with this question of just price, and some of them have a very sophisticated understanding of that as well.
They do. Although a lot of them lack one thing that Smith saw, a real advancement he made, was just the benefits of the division of labor, the fact that you can create wealth. And then beyond Smith, I point out Jean-Baptiste Say, I think, made a really important contribution that Smith distinguished between productive labor and unproductive labor. That basically making stuff is productive labor to Smith, and unproductive labor is like, being an academic or a pastor or something like that. I mean, he lists those things. And Say said, no, actually, intellectual labor is productive, and even in fact, the act of exchange is productive. And I think that just experience bears that out. If you go to the store and you want to buy a candy bar and it's like $1 or whatever, you pay the clerk $1 and they give you a candy bar. And the clerk considers himself better off because he'd rather have $1 than the candy bar that he was stocking. And you consider yourself better off because you'd rather have a candy bar than the $1 that you gave him. Welfare or wealth has increased because of that exchange. Now, maybe not overall physical health for the man who eats the candy bar, but we can get into those sort of quibbles and all of that. But that's the general idea. And he also coined the term entrepreneurship. He talked about the entrepreneur who sees these opportunities, who makes new products. And so this is a really important advancement from Say. And Sorry, remind me. Give me back to the question.
So the question is what is revolutional about,
yes, okay, so the marginal revolution. So
yeah.
what the marginal revolution does is they actually, several of them acknowledge that Say already intuited this, but he couldn't quite formalize the principle. And what it locks into is this idea of where do prices really come from? So, and this is kind of the discipline's answer to Marx, because Marx had an ideology. He's an atheist, a determinist, a materialist, but he also had an analysis. He thought what he was doing was scientific. He made that claim, partly because he had a dialectic and he's a more German sort of thinker, but partly because he said, I have an equation. And the equation is this. The prices of things directly reflects the labor to produce them. And both of these he's getting, or the next one he's getting from Aristotle, that for him, when somebody exchanges two things, that indicates that they're of equal value. So remember what I just said about Say, when we actually exchange things in the real world, it's actually because we both think we're getting a deal. Mm-hmm. We don't think it's of equal value. I want that candy bar more than my dollar. You want my dollar more than the candy bar. That's why an exchange happens. If you thought they were equal value, be indifferent about it. You wouldn't care about exchanging it. So this is just fundamentally mistaken. And so there's a problem with the analysis. The labor side of it, as far as prices, is also mistaken. And an example I give in the book. So the marginal revolution, the whole idea of marginal utility is it's just that prices reflect how much someone wants one more unit of a thing. And that's going to diminish as more units, come about. So if I'm really hungry and someone says, hey, loaf of bread, $4, I'd be like, yeah, $4, great. Loaf of bread, I'm fed. And then they're like, hey, 2 for $7. Oh, yeah, I could
eat some more bread.
Yeah, I could, I'll save one for later, right? I'll get through 2 loaves of bread. And they're like, oh, 3 for $10. And I'm like, yeah, I think, I could share with some people. I could invite some friends over. Okay, 3. And eventually, how about 4? In fact, you know what? We're going to throw in an extra one. You got to have 5. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, I don't even want the 5th one. That's just going to get moldy, right? It has a negative utility to me. I wouldn't pay any money for that. I'd pay you to keep it, right? Or something like that. That's the principle. That's all they're talking about. And so I illustrate this with reference to the card game Magic the Gathering, produced by Wizard of the Coast. I think it was 2023, they had this genius idea where they got their rights to make Lord of the Rings themed Magic the Gathering cards. So it's this tradable, collectible card game. Literally, we're talking about rectangles of cardboard with some art on them, maybe some foil or something like that. They are, as far as the material,
you're just stacking the nerdery on top.
Right.
Layers.
As far as the material that goes into making them, we're talking pennies or less than that. The labor, I'm sure there's development in terms of game design, all of that, but it's not for any particular card. It's not any more labor. For any particular pack of cards that all are same store retail price, not any difference, right? But they had this great gimmick. There's, of course, in Lord of the Rings, the One Ring. And so they had a One Ring card, and they had a specific, unique printing of that card. And there was only one. So it was the one ring. And of course, every collector wanted that one. And so people are opening these like $12 packs of cardboard cards. And eventually, a young woman opens the One Ring. She paid $12. She opened a pack. She gets the One Ring. And then she sells it at auction for $2 million to Grammy-nominated artist Post Malone. Now, for the Marxist labor theory of value to be correct, it would have to be $2 million worth of labor that price reflects. But how do you differentiate between that and every other card and every other pack of cards and everything else, or the labor of opening? There's no difference in the labor of her opening that pack of cards compared to any other one. And this is the difference. Marginal utility can explain that. People wanted that particular card. How much for one more of the one ring? $2 million. Post Malone was not the only person even to bid $2 million, right? There were multiple people that were so invested in this and that it mattered to them that's what they're willing to pay. Most of us would probably pay $0 for that and have no interest in it whatsoever. But that's exactly the point of the marginal revolution, is that prices reflect subjective marginal utility. It's not the same for everyone, but what we have is a kind of aggregate, and that aggregate comes through in the price. And because of this discovery, and it was discovered by multiple economists, 4 different ones, all at the same time. So Leon Walras, Karl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and then John Bates Clark. All different regions of the world. Clark's American, Menger's Austrian, and you have the others. And it revolutionizes the discipline. They still have the stuff they got from Smith. Division of labor, supply and demand, gains from trade, things like that. They still build on that. It's not like that's suddenly thrown out the window. But they have this new tool. For now, they really precisely know what makes a price and what makes a profit. Profit, it turns out, is at least not necessarily a matter of exploitation. Again, that's what Marx said. Marx reasoned that, well, if it's the amount of labor that reflects the price, how does the price that the capitalist receives ever exceed the cost of the thing that goes up there? He said, well, it's because they're shortchanging all their workers, right? That's how they make a profit, because we know how much it's worth, how much labor went into it just by the price, according to Marx. And so he thought that all profit was exploitation. And they show that's not the case. So that's revolutionary from a moral point of view as well. And all of these guys really interestingly had their own moral points of view. You do get a lot more calculus in the discipline, a lot more mathematization, but you still have these moral concerns. So that hasn't gone away yet, even at this point. And that does, as you said, it really does revolutionize the discipline.
So this is sort of the definitive answer to sort of the scientific socialists, the so-called scientific socialists. Yep. And it changes the way we think about economics. Why doesn't the story end there?
Yeah, good question.
We sort of understand the price mechanism in this very robust way, in a way that you can do all the graphs now, you can do all that. You have an immense rise in living standards throughout the 19th century. With you get people basing legislation based on sort of these economic principles. We talked about the Corn Laws. You have trade liberalization. People are moving freely all over the world. Goods are moving freely all over the world. Everything's great until it's not.
Right.
And when it's not, how do the wheels fall off?
Right. Yeah.
And how does the sort of classical political economy respond?
So, I think the big event is really the Great Depression. And the big figure that really changes, not so much changes, but, we can say charitably at least builds on the previous people, although he is somewhat controversial, especially probably among our listeners. The major figure is John Maynard Keynes. Keynes, first of all, talked about, he wrote the economic consequences of the peace, talking about the Treaty of Versailles, saying this is really bad. He was
aftermath of the First World War.
Yes, aftermath of the First World War. He's like, this is really bad. We're setting Germany up for failure and a repeat of what's going on. And it really felt prescient. He was on the committee and he resigned from it out of principle because he saw how bad things were turning out, and he wrote this book. So he got some fame for that. And then the Great Depression happens, and he had this new perspective on economics. He's really the father of macroeconomics. And one of the things he pointed out that I do think he deserves credit for, and it's not something that even is that novel for him, it's just that he really analyzed it with a greater depth than anyone before him, is that marginal utility is not the only factor in prices. There is at least one other factor in prices, and that is inflation. It is how much is the dollar or currency that the price is measured in worth. And if you have fluctuating value of the dollar or the pound or whatever, that's going to affect prices too. In fact, that globally affects all prices, right? And maybe, inflation actually can be uneven between markets and industries and things like that. But he's right about that. We might disagree with his analysis for what are the solutions and all that. And I point out some of the problems in the book. But he's right about that added feature. And that's where you get this, kind of the modern schools of economics are often divided on more this macro monetary policy sort of level rather than necessarily kind of the micro fundamentals of the discipline. I think most economists today, right wing, left wing, whatever, anywhere in between, as long as they're not a Marxist, they would say that, private property, exchange, supply and demand, marginal utility, totally agree on all of that. They disagree on the small little margins of policy and on the big questions of, yes, but what about these big policy issues, government deficit spending that increases inflation. What do we do to prevent the next Great Depression? So Keynes had his solution, and then eventually you get Milton Friedman kind of in his, I can't remember his co-writer. I really should.
Anna Schwartz.
Yeah, Anna Schwartz. Thank you. And they come up with what is really understood to be a better solution, because by the 1970s, it's pretty clear that Keynes's analysis is somewhat flawed. And so today they both have affected the Federal Reserve, which has a standard of full employment, which is a very Keynesian standard, but also a standard of a stable currency, which is a very Friedman-esque, standard. And some would say those are contradictory goals, but they have them both. And despite any woes we've had of late, the U.S. dollar is still the world's reserve currency for a reason, and it could be a lot worse.
We continue to muddle through.
Yes,
due to the great blessings, institutionally and culturally, and in terms of natural resources, all of this.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that comes out of these crises, though, and one of these things that you see as economics as a discipline gets more and more dominated by bureaucrats and policymakers.
Yeah.
Which Keynes and Friedman both sort of were at various points in their career.
Yeah.
Is economics gets more and more divorced from these moral questions.
Yes.
What's that story? So
that story, at least the way I tell it, and I think it's a bigger story than what I tell, but at least what I tell is, I think, closer to the truth than what I was told. And I don't mean that I was deceived or anything like that, but I remember talking to good Christian economists, people we work with here at Acton, about this sort of thing. And usually their story is the marginal revolution happened, and then calculus gets introduced to the discipline. And then, maybe they, if they really have done some study, they might mention Max Weber, who's a sociologist, but he talked about how social science is supposed to be value-free in the early 20th century. But what I found, very interestingly, was that people, especially in the midst of the Great Depression and the World Wars, economists were still doing political economy. They still thought morality mattered. So Keynes talks about economics as a moral science. Unfortunately, his morality, again, as Phil Magnus points out, his morality was eugenics, which is morally monstrous. But he had a normative standard. I'm not saying I endorse it, but that was part of his analysis. Should make us very hesitant to adopt all of his analysis from a Christian point of view, and I talk about that in the book. Friedrich Hayek has moral concerns, and he's a liberal, but he cares about a fairly structured economy. He's actually kind of a Rawlsian, which might surprise some people to find out, but he really cares about the rules of the game. His work on the Constitution of Liberty is kind of all about that. And that was, he doesn't like the term social justice, but basically he explicitly says, other than the term, I'm basically trying to do what Rawls was doing. Like, he says, yeah, that's kind of the same sort of thing that I'm going for. So this idea of justice or fairness, he's kind of doing that. That's in the background. Wilhelm Röpke, one of the architects of the West German economic miracle, their recovery after World War II, he is a devout Lutheran. And in his economics books, he says, my view of man is that he's created in the image of God, and it's a grave sin to treat him as a mere means rather than an end in himself. Right? And it's just part of his analysis. He cares about moral culture, and he has a very deep analysis, for example, in the social crisis of our time, where he starts with that. He thinks it's so important that we got to understand that. So what we find, though, is there is a parallel. And there always had been, like I said, that distinction between the strict economic analysis and the application. But suddenly you get figures like Joseph Schumpeter, who's from the Austrian school, kind of this weird ball of contradictions. I call him a Austrian school big business socialist, which I think is actually an accurate characterization of Schumpeter's position. But he has a massive history of economics.
Which is excellent.
But again and again, you can see that he is uncomfortable with trying to tie together moral analysis and economics. He really wants it to be distinct from that. And then you have, and he's important for our understanding of entrepreneurship and the development of that. So he is influential in some ways. Paul Samuelson was very influential. He basically took Keynes and he made a textbook, and he made a more popular sort of popularization textbook that was adopted in across colleges and universities for a good 20 years in the mid-20th century. And there he makes this statement, which is interesting, and I do think it points out that there is a value-free component to economics, but he kind of takes the part for the whole, and he says, somebody who wants to cure disease and a mad scientist who wants to spread it need the same bacteriology. Right? So you have a different moral motivation, but you have to have the same science if they want to be effective in their goal. And he says, well, economics is like that, right? And I'm fairly sympathetic to that. Again, I just don't think that that's where it needs to stop, because economists today, even if that's their perspective, they go on TV all the time and they say, well, what we ought to do or what we should do is X, Y, and Z. Ought and should are moral terms, right? You're evoking a norm. And if you don't reflect on that, it's just going to be something hodgepodge together, might be inconsistent, might be inadequate. So that's where that political economy, that application needs the moral side. But then lastly, I do put a lot of blame at Milton Friedman's feet. As much as I think he's a great economist, and I think he did, he contributed a lot of good things. I even think he had real moral motivations. I think his work on school choice has, at least an understanding that everyone deserves the freedom to educate their children however they want, and introducing competition is going to enliven the market for schools and all of that. So I think he had moral motivations, but he's actually very clear that he thinks that economics is just fundamentally a positive, value-free science, and that's really all it has to add. And he also kind of flattens social analysis. So, I mentioned that old map of church, state, and family. Well, Adam Smith had kind of his own way of doing things. He talked about the government or the state. He talked about commercial society or the market, and then he talked about beneficent society, which I actually thought was the most important. And we might call that civil society today. And in Friedman, it's not like he doesn't know about civil society, but it's just, again and again, the way in which he reasons, it's almost like all there is to society is market and state. And I think you find a lot of that today in, the editorial sections of the Wall Street Journal or, something like that. That's kind of the secular and secularized perspective on things. And that's kind of my story of how we get to where we are today. I call it the Great Divergence, because it's really like a mid-20th century thing. And I had no idea it was so recent. It's something that, to me, shows that there's an opportunity. And I think there's enough economists today that are a little uneasy with the current status quo of their discipline, that it raises the question that, well, Christians and, people who want to do Christian social thought, including Orthodox Christians, have something to contribute if they take the time to listen and actually learn some of the basics of modern economics, so they're not just moralizing and that kind of thing. We might actually have what they're looking for. And that's exciting. I think that's one of many, goals of Christian social thought, and including Orthodox Christian social thought, is to help bridge that gap, to once again give a more robust political economy.
Yep. And this is something that is found in the roots of the discipline itself. Mm-hmm. As part of this is not that this is totally foreign to economics, but in fact was an integral part of the discipline that's been lost, and that folks of religious faith can help economics return to its moral foundations. Yeah. Dylan, thank you so much for an amazing book and for a sort of whirlwind tour of that history. Yeah. It's a very accessibly written history. It gets at the major figures. And it's also like there are things in there that I would quibble about, and I would push back, and maybe we will do yet another episode on this, in which I will try to sort of reclaim a sort of Friedmanite scientific heritage.
Sure.
But it's exactly what the church needs right now.
Glad to hear
that. It is an invitation to participate in an ongoing program about how to best serve our neighbors, and it's a great conversation starter, and it's full of tons of great history and a lot of great insight. And thank you for sharing it with us all.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.